There are people whose lives leave so little visible trace that their absence is noticed primarily through the disruption of small routines rather than through the grief of those who knew them well. Leonard Hale was such a person, 53 years old when he died, apparently from a heart attack that occurred while he was sitting at his kitchen table eating dinner he'd prepared according to the same recipe rotation he'd followed for the past 8 years, his body discovered 3 days later when a neighbor named Mrs. Chen noticed his mail accumulating in the building's lobby and mentioned it to the building manager, who had a master key and the legal authority to perform wellness checks on tenants who might be experiencing medical emergencies. The absence of immediate discovery wasn't neglect exactly. Leonard had no family living nearby, had cultivated no friendships intimate enough that anyone would expect daily contact, had structured his life in ways that made his presence or absence essentially invisible to the people who occupied adjacent social and physical space. He'd lived in the same one-bedroom apartment for 19 years, paid his rent automatically through direct deposit on the first of each month, maintained the space adequately without creating maintenance issues that would require landlord intervention, participated in building life only to the minimal extent that basic courtesy required, nodding to neighbors in the elevator, accepting packages for others when delivery services left them at his door, attending mandatory building meetings about repairs or policy changes. His neighbors, if asked to describe him, would have struggled to provide specific details beyond the most basic demographic facts. Middle-aged man, living alone, worked regular office hours based on his consistent departure around 7:30 each morning and return around 6:15 each evening. Nice was the word most would use, though that descriptor revealed more about the absence of negative qualities than the presence of positive ones. He wasn't loud, wasn't difficult, wasn't the source of complaints or conflicts, which in urban apartment living constituted a significant form of virtue even if it didn't suggest any particular warmth or connection. Leonard had worked as a compliance officer for a company called Meridian Logistics, a mid-sized firm that managed supply chain operations for various corporate clients. His role involved reviewing shipping documentation to ensure it met regulatory requirements, maintaining records of safety inspections and certifications, preparing reports for auditors demonstrating that the company adhered to relevant laws and industry standards. It was detail-oriented work that required systematic attention but that existed almost entirely behind the scenes. No clients interacted with Leonard directly, no dramatic decisions depended on his analysis, no crises would be averted or caused by his daily labor. Just steady, unglamorous maintenance of compliance systems that prevented problems primarily through their boring reliability. He'd held this position for 14 years, preceded by similar compliance roles at other companies, his entire career following a consistent pattern: entry-level compliance work after college, gradual accumulation of expertise and credentials, lateral moves to different companies that offered slightly better pay or benefits but essentially identical responsibilities. He'd never managed anyone, had never been promoted beyond individual contributor roles, had never expressed interest in advancement that would require leadership responsibilities or client-facing work that would take him away from the methodical document review that constituted his primary occupational activity. His colleagues at Meridian would have described him similarly to how his neighbors did: competent, reliable, quiet, someone who performed his role adequately without creating additional work for others or requiring unusual amounts of supervision or support. He attended required meetings, responded to emails within reasonable time frames, submitted his reports on schedule, never called in sick though he took his allocated vacation days with the same regularity he brought to all aspects of his life, always the third week of March and the second week of September, destinations unknown to his colleagues because he never discussed his personal life and no one thought to ask. The truth, which Leonard had no occasion to share with anyone and which would have struck his colleagues as unexpectedly depressing if they'd known, was that his vacation weeks were spent essentially identically to his work weeks except without the commute to the office. He would maintain the same wake-up time, the same meal schedule, the same evening routines of reading and television and the modest household tasks that filled hours between dinner and sleep. He'd chosen March and September for these vacation weeks not because he had destinations in mind but because those months represented seasonal transitions when absence from work would be least disruptive, when the compliance reporting schedule had natural lulls that made his availability less critical. He took his vacations because company policy mandated it, because not taking them would draw attention and questions about why he was accumulating unused time off, because performing normalcy required participating in the rhythms that normal people followed even when the substance of those rhythms, time off for rest or travel or family gatherings, didn't apply to his actual circumstances. So he would stay home for those weeks, would maintain his routines in a slightly modified form, would return to work after the designated period without anyone asking about his time away because his colleagues had learned long ago that Leonard didn't encourage personal conversation and that attempting to engage him beyond professional necessities created awkwardness that made both parties uncomfortable. This life, solitary, routine-driven, essentially invisible to everyone who encountered it, had not been Leonard's conscious ambition when he was younger. At 23, newly graduated from a state university with a degree in business administration and uncertain about what direction to pursue, he'd imagined some version of conventional adult success, career advancement, romantic partnership, perhaps eventually marriage and children, the standard trajectory that his parents had followed and that society suggested was natural outcome of doing things correctly. But somewhere in his late 20s, through accumulated small disappointments and failed attempts at social connection and the gradual recognition that the ease with which other people formed relationships was not something he possessed, Leonard had recalibrated his expectations. Had stopped pursuing romantic relationships that consistently failed after first or second dates, had stopped accepting invitations to social gatherings where he would spend awkward hours on the periphery of conversations, had stopped trying to perform versions of himself that might be more appealing to others and had instead settled into the person he apparently was, someone more comfortable alone, someone who found routines comforting rather than constraining, someone whose inner life was adequately rich to sustain himself without requiring external validation or connection. This recalibration hadn't been dramatic or traumatic. Had just been gradual acceptance of mismatch between the life he'd imagined and the life that was actually available to him given his particular temperament and capacities. The acceptance brought relief, stopped requiring constant effort to be someone he wasn't, stopped the repeated disappointment of social failures, stopped the exhausting performance of normalcy in contexts where he'd never quite managed to achieve it convincingly. Better to be alone by choice, or at least by acceptance, than to keep failing at connection and interpreting that failure as evidence of fundamental inadequacy. So he'd built a life that accommodated his solitude, that created structure and routine sufficient to fill the hours between work and sleep, that asked nothing of others and exposed him to minimal rejection or disappointment. It was not a happy life in any conventional sense. Leonard was not happy, would not have described himself as such if anyone had thought to ask. But it was manageable, was sustainable, was preferable to the alternatives he'd experienced during his years of attempting connection that consistently revealed he lacked whatever capacities made such connection natural and easy for others. What no one who encountered Leonard knew, what he had no opportunity to share and what would have been difficult to communicate even if opportunities had existed, was that his interior life contained substantially more complexity and observation than his exterior presentation suggested. He was not simply going through motions, not living in some diminished state of consciousness where nothing registered except the immediate requirements of daily routine. He noticed things, thought about things, had opinions and reactions and internal monologues that were sometimes quite sharp and occasionally approached something like humor, though that humor had no external expression because there was no audience for it and because Leonard had learned long ago that his attempts at humor often fell flat or created discomfort rather than the shared amusement that humor was apparently supposed to generate. He noticed, for instance, the peculiar dynamics of workplace meetings, the way certain colleagues would dominate discussion not because they had particularly valuable contributions but because they possessed confidence or status that made their voices carry more weight, the way important decisions would be presented as collaborative outcomes even when it was obvious the decision had been made before the meeting began and the discussion was just performance of consensus building, the way people would nod and agree to action items they clearly had no intention of completing. Leonard would sit quietly in these meetings, would contribute when specifically asked for compliance perspective, would take notes that documented what was said though he understood those notes primarily served to create appearance of engagement rather than to record information he couldn't remember without written documentation. He noticed the small deceptions and self-deceptions that structured workplace social relations, the way people would express enthusiasm for projects they clearly found tedious, would praise colleagues they privately criticized, would maintain friendly professional relationships with people they actively disliked. Leonard had no moral judgment about these performances, understood they were necessary accommodations to the requirement that work relationships remain functional even when actual affinity or respect didn't exist. But he also recognized he was particularly bad at these performances, that his attempts to simulate enthusiasm or warmth came across as obviously insincere in ways that made others uncomfortable, so he'd learned to minimize his participation in the social dimensions of workplace life and to restrict himself to the technical compliance work that didn't require him to perform emotional states he didn't feel. He noticed patterns in his apartment building's communal spaces, the way certain neighbors would consistently fail to clean up after themselves in the mail room or laundry facilities, the way building management would announce initiatives to improve community engagement that would generate brief flurries of activity before everyone reverted to previous patterns of minimal interaction, the way people would complain about various building issues without ever actually organizing to address them. Collectively, Leonard had no illusions about building community himself, knew he was even less suited to that kind of social organizing than most of the other residents, but he found the patterns interesting in anthropological sense, as evidence of how people navigated the awkward space between being neighbors, sharing building, having common interests in maintenance and safety, and being strangers, having no actual relationship or obligation to each other beyond basic courtesy. He noticed things about the city generally, patterns of development and change visible in his commute route, businesses that would open with optimistic signage and then close within months, the way certain streets or neighborhoods would transform dramatically while others remained essentially unchanged across years. Leonard had lived in this city for his entire adult life, had watched it evolve through various economic and demographic shifts, had accumulated mental catalog of its history and geography that was probably more detailed than most longtime residents possessed simply because he had time and attention to notice changes that people embedded in active social lives and demanding family obligations might not register. And he had internal monologues, running commentary on what he observed, sometimes critical, sometimes sympathetic, sometimes attempting something like humor though he was his only audience. When colleagues would describe their weekends in the break room on Monday mornings, the children's activities, the social gatherings, the home improvement projects, Leonard would listen and would think things he never said aloud: sounds exhausting, or I wonder if they actually enjoy that or just think they're supposed to, or at least my weekend didn't involve a 5-year-old's birthday party at a place designed specifically to give adults migraines. These thoughts weren't malicious, weren't motivated by jealousy or resentment exactly, though they probably contained elements of both. They were just Leonard's honest reactions to social performances he found puzzling or exhausting even as second-hand observers. When neighbors would make small talk in the elevator, "How's your day going?" delivered in tone that made clear they didn't actually want detailed response, Leonard would smile appropriately and say, "Fine, thanks," while thinking things like, "Well, I spent 8 hours reviewing shipping manifests and now I'm going home to eat dinner alone while watching a documentary about infrastructure failures, so I guess it depends on your standards," or, "About as well as can be expected for someone who's most." Significant social interaction today was this 11-second elevator conversation. These internal responses were defense mechanism and coping strategy, ways of maintaining some sense of agency and perspective in life that often felt like it was happening to him rather than being actively chosen or controlled. The humor, such as it was, allowed him to observe his circumstances with slight distance, to see the absurdity in his situation without being entirely crushed by the loneliness and disconnection that also characterized it. He understood he was lonely. Understood his life was objectively sad by most conventional measures. But finding ways to be slightly amused by that sadness made it marginally more bearable than just experiencing it as unalloyed tragedy. Leonard died on a Tuesday evening in October, though his death wasn't discovered until Friday afternoon when Mrs. Chen mentioned the accumulated mail. The heart attack had been sudden, he'd been eating dinner, had experienced chest pain that he'd initially attributed to indigestion, had stood up intending to take antacid from the bathroom medicine cabinet, had lost consciousness before reaching the bathroom and had died probably within minutes. The myocardial infarction massive enough that survival would have been unlikely even if emergency services had been immediately available. But because Leonard had no one checking on him daily, no standing plans that would be missed, no pets that would need care, no job that tracked employees' presence closely enough to be concerned about a single day's absence, his death remained undiscovered for 72 hours. His body was found in his apartment's small hallway, having fallen forward and remained there, the discovery made by the building manager who'd entered with Mrs. Chen waiting nervously in the apartment's doorway. both of them understanding something was seriously wrong before the door had fully opened, the distinctive smell of human decomposition already permeating the apartment even after only 3 days. The authorities were notified. Police arrived to confirm no foul play was suspected, paramedics confirmed death and estimated timing, building manager provided contact information for Leonard's employer and for the emergency contact listed on his lease application. A cousin in a different state whom Leonard hadn't actually spoken to in perhaps a decade but whose name and phone number had been required by the lease agreement, so Leonard had listed him as closest thing to next of kin available. The cousin, named Derek, 49 years old, working in pharmaceutical sales in a city 8 hours away, received the call and experienced complicated emotions, genuine sadness that another human being had died, particularly a family member even if distant, mixed with guilt about not having maintained relationship with Leonard, mixed with relief that he wasn't being asked to make decisions about disposition of remains or to assume financial responsibility for anything, mixed with immediate practical concern about what obligations he actually had in this situation. It turned out his obligations were minimal. Leonard had made arrangements years earlier, had purchased basic funeral plan through a service that specialized in exactly this situation, single people without family who wanted to ensure their death wouldn't create burdens for others or result in anonymous burial. The plan covered minimal service, basic cremation, no frills but adequate and dignified. Derek was informed he could attend the service if he wished but that his presence wasn't required, that everything had been prepaid and prearranged, that Leonard had even selected a lawyer to serve as executor of his modest estate and to handle the minimal administrative details that death requires. The lawyer was a man named Robert Chen, no relation to Mrs. Chen, 41 years old, running a small practice that specialized in wills and estates for middle-class clients who had simple situations. Leonard had met with him 6 years earlier, had explained he wanted to establish basic will and funeral arrangements, had been methodical and clear about his instructions, had paid the modest fee and had updated the documents every 2 years to ensure they remained current. Robert had filed the paperwork and hadn't thought about Leonard again until receiving the call about his death, at which point he'd reviewed the file and had discovered the audio recording Leonard had left with instructions that it be played at his funeral service. The funeral was scheduled for Thursday afternoon at a chapel that specialized in modest services for people without church affiliations. The chapel was modern and deliberately inoffensive, neutral decor, non-denominational symbolism, facilities adequate for small gatherings without being expensive. Robert had arranged for notice to be sent to Leonard's employer and to the few contacts that could be identified through Leonard's apartment, neighbors who'd been interviewed by building management, the cousin Derek who'd been informed of the death. Approximately 28 people attended. Derek had made the 8-hour drive, felt it was appropriate even though he'd barely known Leonard. 7 co-workers from Meridian Logistics attended, 3 from Leonard's immediate department who felt attendance was professional obligation, 4 others who'd worked with him occasionally and who'd come primarily because corporate culture suggested attending colleagues' funerals was appropriate gesture. 6 neighbors from Leonard's building attended, Mrs. Chin who'd discovered his absence, 3 others who'd known him by sight and who felt some combination of curiosity and obligation, building manager and his assistant who'd dealt with the aftermath of discovery and who felt their attendance showed appropriate respect for a long-term tenant. Several other attendees were harder to categorize, a woman who'd been Leonard's supervisor 15 years earlier at a different company and who'd somehow learned of his death and come out of vague sense that she should, 2 people who'd been college acquaintances and who'd received notice through alumni network, 3 people whose connection to Leonard was unclear even to themselves. They'd known him peripherally through some forgotten context and had felt drawn to attend perhaps because they sensed he would have few mourners and that empty funeral chapel felt worse than whatever minor inconvenience attending created. The service began at 2 p.m. People filed in, sat scattered through the chapel in patterns that revealed their relationships or lack thereof, the co-workers clustered together, the neighbors in their own group, individuals sitting alone because they knew no one else present. The chapel's sound system played soft instrumental music, nothing specific or memorable, just the kind of generic solemn background that funeral industry had identified as appropriate for these occasions. A chaplain who'd never met Leonard and who was employed by the chapel to conduct services for people without clergy relationships said brief words about death and memory and the hope that Leonard had found peace. He read a prepared obituary that Robert had written based on basic biographical facts. Born 1970, graduated from State University 1992, worked in logistics industry, survived by cousin Derek and various more distant relatives. The obituary was accurate and completely inadequate, captured none of whatever had been particular about Leonard's life or consciousness, but it fulfilled its minimal function of marking that this person had existed and had now died. Then Robert stood, walked to the small podium at the front of the chapel, held papers that contained remarks he'd prepared about the legal details of settling Leonard's estate. Who to contact about what, where documents would be filed, basic information that needed to be communicated. But before beginning those remarks, he cleared his throat and said, Leonard left specific instructions regarding this service. He requested that a recording be played at this time. A murmur moved through the sparse attendance. This was unusual though not unprecedented, recorded eulogies from people who couldn't attend in person or from deceased individuals who'd wanted to share final words weren't unheard of. People shifted in their seats, attention focusing forward with mixture of curiosity and expectation that whatever was about to be played would maintain the solemn dignified tone appropriate for funeral settings. Robert pressed play on the audio system. There was brief static, then Leonard's voice filled the chapel. His voice was exactly as his coworkers and neighbors would remember it, calm, measured, without particular effect, the voice of someone who spoke carefully and rarely inflected beyond what was strictly necessary for basic communication. Well, Leonard's recorded voice said, if you're hearing this, it means I've finally managed to be late for something. The words landed strangely. A few people shifted uncomfortably, uncertain whether this was attempt at humor or just awkward phrasing. The statement was objectively true. Leonard had been notably punctual in life. His absence from this funeral was indeed the first time most attendees could recall him failing to appear when expected, but making this observation about one's own death felt off somehow, violated the unspoken protocols about how deceased people were supposed to be memorialized. I assume most of you are surprised to be here, Leonard continued. Don't worry, I am too. I didn't expect anyone to attend actually. But Robert tells me he's required to hold some kind of service, and apparently a few of you felt obligated to show up, so here we are. A nervous chuckle escaped from somewhere in the back rows. Then silence resumed as people tried to determine what exactly was happening, whether this was going to be conventional farewell or something else entirely. I've been thinking about what to say to you, Leonard's voice continued, and I realize I spent my entire life not saying what I actually thought. Seems safer that way. Less chance of offending people or making them uncomfortable or revealing that I was probably more isolated and sad than they wanted to know about. So this recording is my chance to correct that. Once it no longer matters. The chapel had gone very quiet. People were listening now with different quality of attention, recognizing this was not going to be standard memorial remarks. What followed over the next 18 minutes was Leonard's methodical, dry, occasionally darkly funny accounting of various aspects of his life that he'd never discussed with anyone while living. He structured it as series of observations and acknowledgments directed at specific categories of people who might be present, though his tone made clear he had no illusions that many of these categories would actually be represented in the attendance. To my family, if any of you are here, Leonard's voice said, thank you for coming even though we haven't spoken in years. I know I was difficult to stay in touch with. I didn't call on holidays or visit for reunions or maintain the kinds of connections that families are supposed to maintain. This was my failure, not yours, though I'm not sure I regret it. Our family gatherings always made me feel more alone than being actually alone, which probably says something unflattering about me but which was nonetheless true. Derek, sitting 3 rows from the front, felt his face grow hot. The observation was accurate. Leonard had indeed stopped attending family events years ago, had always seemed uncomfortable when he had attended, but hearing it stated so plainly at his funeral felt both honest and painful. To my co-workers, Leonard continued, I appreciate you taking time from your actual work to attend this. I know most of you didn't really know me beyond seeing me in meetings or passing in the hallway. That's fine. I didn't really know you either. But I did notice things. I noticed that Susan from accounting has been having an affair with someone, not my business who, but it was fairly obvious if you paid attention to the patterns of when she'd leave early and who else would be mysteriously unavailable. I noticed that Mike in operations hates his job and is probably drinking more than he should based on how he looked at Monday morning meetings. I noticed that Jennifer talks constantly about her children not because she's particularly proud of them but because she's terrified of silence and children provide safe conversation topics. Several coworkers shifted very uncomfortably. Susan's face had gone pale. Mike was staring at his hands. Jennifer was frozen, uncertain whether to feel angry or exposed or both. The other coworkers were experiencing mixture of fascination and horror, fascination that quiet Leonard had apparently been observing them quite closely, horror that he was sharing these observations at his own funeral. I don't say these things to be cruel, Leonard's voice continued calmly. I say them because they're true and because I spent years sitting quietly while people performed their various fictions about how well they were doing and how happy they were. I participated in those performances too, pretended I was fine when people asked how I was doing, pretended I had plans for the weekend, pretended I was a normal person just temporarily between relationships or social engagements rather than someone who'd fundamentally given up on those things years ago. He paused. The recording captured what might have been Leonard taking a sip of something, then continuing. The truth is I was lonely. Profoundly, consistently lonely for most of my adult life. But admitting that while alive would have made people uncomfortable and would have required them to either try to include me, which neither they nor I actually wanted, or to explicitly acknowledge they didn't want to include me, which would have made me pitiable. So I maintained the fiction that I was fine, and everyone else maintained the fiction that they believed me, and we all collaborated in this mutually comfortable deception. Mrs. Chen, sitting in the fourth row, felt tears beginning. She'd lived across the hall from Leonard for 8 years and had never once invited him for dinner or suggested he join any of the building's occasional social gatherings. She'd always assumed he preferred solitude, had never questioned whether that preference was choice or accommodation to rejection. To my neighbors, Leonard continued, thank you for not complaining about noise or causing problems. Thank you for the occasional nods in the elevator, which were more pleasant than you probably realized. Thank you particularly to Mrs. Chen for noticing when I died, which was considerate given that no one else would have noticed for potentially much longer. I'm sorry my death created unpleasantness for you. I tried to time it for maximum convenience but heart attacks don't really cooperate with planning. The chapel had moved past discomfort into something stranger. People weren't sure if they should be horrified or if Leonard's deadpan delivery of genuinely dark material was creating something approaching humor. The line about timing his death for convenience was objectively absurd and was delivered with such complete flatness that it became almost funny despite being about literal death. I'd like to share a few memories, Leonard's voice continued, that might give you sense of what my life actually involved, since I doubt any of you really knew. What followed was Leonard describing specific moments from his life with surgical honesty and dry observational humor. He described a first date from approximately 6 years earlier where the woman had clearly decided within the first 10 minutes that she wasn't interested but had suffered through the remaining hour and 20 minutes of dinner with increasingly obvious impatience while Leonard had known exactly what was happening but had continued the date because leaving early would have required acknowledging the failure explicitly and he'd found it easier to just endure the awkwardness. By the end, Leonard's voice said, we were both just waiting for socially acceptable moment to end things, like two actors who'd forgotten their lines but who kept performing because walking off stage mid-scene seemed worse than continuing the obviously failed show. A few people laughed nervously. The image was painful but also recognizable. Many in attendance had experienced similar situations where social protocol required enduring discomfort rather than acknowledging it directly. He described a work meeting from approximately 3 years earlier where he'd prepared a presentation about compliance issues that no one paid attention to because a more senior colleague had dominated the meeting with unrelated concerns, and Leonard had sat there with his carefully prepared materials growing increasingly aware that no one was going to ask him to present and that the meeting would end without his contribution, and he'd felt simultaneously relieved, because presenting would have been stressful, and resentful that he'd wasted hours preparing for a presentation that wasn't going to happen. I smiled politely when the meeting ended, Leonard's voice said, and someone thanked me for attending, which was particularly absurd since attendance had been mandatory and I'd done literally nothing during the 90 minutes except exist silently in a conference room chair. More people were laughing now, though the laughter had uncomfortable edge to it. The situation was funny in its absurdity but also sad in its clear illustration of Leonard's marginalization. He described practicing smiling in the bathroom mirror at work, trying to achieve expression that looked genuine rather than slightly deranged, because he'd noticed people seemed unsettled when he smiled in ways that suggested he didn't smile often or naturally. "I'd stand there for 5 or 10 minutes, Leonard said, trying different variations: small smile, medium smile, smile with teeth, smile without teeth, like I was a robot trying to approximate human emotion through physical mimicry. Which I suppose is more accurate than I'd like to admit. I never did figure out the right smile. People always looked slightly concerned when I deployed any of the variations I'd practiced." The chapel had fully broken now. People were laughing openly, though many were also crying or appearing deeply uncomfortable. The image of Leonard standing alone in a bathroom practicing smiling was simultaneously funny and heartbreaking, was exactly the kind of detail that shouldn't be funny but that became funny through Leonard's completely flat delivery and through the uncomfortable recognition that many people had done similar things, had practiced their public presentations in private, had tried to reverse engineer what came naturally to others. "I want to be clear," Leonard's voice said, "I'm not telling you these things to make you feel guilty or to suggest you should have been kinder to me. You were fine. You were appropriately polite and professional. The problem wasn't you, it was the fundamental mismatch between how I was constructed psychologically and what successful social existence requires. Some people are naturally good at connection and performance and maintaining relationships. I was not. I tried for years to be that person, and it never worked, so I eventually stopped trying. That was probably the right choice even if it resulted in dying alone in my apartment and not being discovered for 3 days." The laughter had stopped. The last observation had pushed back into territory that was too explicitly sad to be funny, had reminded everyone that however amusing Leonard's delivery was, the underlying reality was genuinely tragic: a person who'd lived mostly alone and who'd died completely alone and whose absence had been noticed primarily through accumulation of uncollected mail. Leonard's voice continued after brief pause. "I don't know what happens after death. Probably nothing. But if I'm somehow aware of this service, I hope you're laughing. Not at me exactly, though I understand if it comes out that way. More at the absurdity of the whole situation, me speaking to you from beyond death, all of us gathered in this chapel to process the uncomfortable fact that someone existed and now doesn't exist, the strange social protocols we maintain around death to avoid acknowledging how arbitrary and final it is." He paused again. When he continued, his tone had shifted slightly, still calm and measured, but carrying more weight. "If you're laughing, good. It means I finally said something honest. I spent 53 years being polite and appropriate and saying what people expected me to say. This recording is my chance to be honest about what my life actually was rather than what I pretended it was. And if that honesty makes you uncomfortable or makes you laugh at inappropriate moments, that's fine. That's better than the comfortable lies we usually maintain, the fictions we collaborate on so no one has to acknowledge the sadness and loneliness and failure that characterize large portions of many people's lives." The recording ended. The chapel was completely silent. No one moved. No one seemed to know what to do with what they just heard, whether to be amused or horrified or sad or some complicated mixture of all three. Robert Chin stood at the podium, his prepared remarks about estate administration seeming completely inadequate to the moment. The chaplain sat frozen in the front row, his generic consoling words having been thoroughly undermined by Leonard's explicit rejection of comfortable lies. The attendees sat in their scattered positions throughout the chapel, each processing privately what had just occurred and what it meant. After perhaps 90 seconds of heavy silence, people began to move. Not leaving exactly, just shifting, looking around at each other with expressions that suggested they weren't quite sure how to proceed. The service was technically over. Leonard's recording had been the main event. Robert's administrative remarks felt unnecessary in aftermath. The normal funeral protocols of receiving line and condolences seemed absurd given that the deceased had just delivered brutally honest accounting of his lonely life. People began standing, moving toward exits, but slowly, uncertainly. And then something unexpected happened. Instead of dispersing immediately to their cars, instead of leaving with the relief that typically follows uncomfortable situations, people began gathering in small groups outside the chapel, began talking to each other in ways that went beyond the superficial condolence conversations that typically occur at funeral receptions. Derek found himself talking to Mrs. Chen. She told him about living across the hall from Leonard for 8 years, about the nods in the elevator, about how she'd never once thought to invite him for dinner or include him in anything despite knowing he lived alone. "I feel terrible," she said. "Not because he was blaming anyone, he wasn't, but because I could have been kinder and I just wasn't. I assumed he wanted to be left alone." "I hadn't talked to him in probably 10 years, Derek admitted. "We were never close as kids, and once we were adults we just drifted apart. I'd think about calling sometimes, especially after holidays when I'd see his name in my contacts, but I never did. I told myself he'd call if he wanted to talk, but I knew he wouldn't call. He was terrible at initiating contact. So my not calling meant we just never spoke." The co-workers were clustered together, processing what Leonard had said about them. Susan looked shaken. The reference to her affair had been vague enough that others might not have understood it, but she'd understood it perfectly and now had to wonder who else had noticed and whether Leonard had told anyone before dying. Mike was defensive. "I don't drink too much, I just had a few rough weeks last year," while the others were pointing out that Leonard hadn't actually said he drank too much, had just observed he looked rough at Monday meetings, which was true and which Mike had to acknowledge even while insisting it was a temporary situation that was now resolved. Jennifer was angry and hurt. "He didn't know anything about why I talk about my children. Maybe I do it because I'm proud of them and they're important to me. Maybe I'm not terrified of silence, maybe I just like sharing my life with colleagues." But even as she said it, she recognized there was truth in Leonard's observation, that she did use her children as conversational shields, that discussions about their activities and accomplishments were safer than more revealing conversations about herself. 2 of the neighbors were discussing whether they should organize some kind of building memorial or whether that would be inappropriate given that Leonard had clearly not wanted that kind of attention during his life. "But he organized this," one of them pointed out, gesturing back toward the chapel. "He clearly wanted something said, wanted some kind of honesty about how he'd lived. Maybe we should honor that by actually acknowledging we could have done better. Or maybe we should honor it by not doing anything," the other responded. "By accepting that he lived the way he wanted to live, alone, private, without requiring us to perform grief we don't actually feel or to create retrospective friendship that didn't exist while he was alive." These conversations continued for perhaps 45 minutes, people reluctant to leave even though the funeral was over, as if Leonard's recording had created some obligation to process collectively what they'd heard, to acknowledge explicitly what had been made uncomfortable visible. These weren't joyful conversations or celebrations of Leonard's life. They were uncomfortable reckonings with how little any of them had known him, with how easy it had been to overlook his loneliness, with how completely normal his isolation had seemed until he'd forced them to see it clearly through his posthumous honesty. Eventually people did disperse. Returned to their cars, drove back to their lives, carried with them the strange discomfort of having laughed at a funeral and having been forced to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about themselves and about how easy it is to participate in someone's isolation without quite meaning to. Leonard's recording would be discussed in various contexts over following days. Co-workers would process it during lunch breaks, neighbors would mention it during elevator conversations, Derek would describe it to his wife trying to articulate why he felt so unsettled by funeral that was technically over but that somehow wouldn't leave his consciousness. But no one created memorial. No one organized tribute. No one tried to retroactively transform Leonard into someone he hadn't been or to pretend the funeral had been moving celebration of rich life well lived. Because that would have been exactly the kind of comfortable lie Leonard had explicitly rejected. Instead, people carried their discomfort, carried the recognition that they'd witnessed something honest and unsettling, carried the uncomfortable awareness that Leonard had achieved in death what he'd apparently never achieved in life, had connected people through truth-telling, had made himself memorable not through accomplishment or relationship but through willingness to state plainly what most people carefully avoided acknowledging. Sometimes humor is how truth survives silence. If it makes people uncomfortable, it might be honest. This is what Leonard understood when he created his funeral recording, that the truth about his life was uncomfortable and sad, and that wrapping that truth in dark humor might be the only way to make it bearable for others to hear, might be the only way to cut through the comfortable fictions that people maintain about loneliness and isolation and failure. Leonard didn't create his recording as act of rebellion or revenge. He wasn't trying to hurt the people who'd ignored him or to force them to feel guilty about his loneliness. He was simply being honest for the first time in his adult life, sharing the reality he'd lived rather than the acceptable fiction he'd maintained, using humor as vehicle to make that honesty deliverable to audience that wouldn't have been able to bear it presented straight. The humor worked because it was true. His observations about practicing smiles in mirrors, about enduring obviously failed dates, about sitting silently through meetings where no one cared about his prepared presentations, these were funny precisely because they were painfully accurate, because many people in attendance recognized similar experiences in their own lives even if they'd never articulated them with Leonard's surgical precision. But the humor also worked because it created permission to acknowledge realities that polite discourse typically suppresses. Funerals conventionally require maintaining certain fictions about the deceased, that they were loved, that they'll be missed, that their lives had meaning and connection. Leonard's recording explicitly rejected these fictions, stated plainly that he'd been lonely and isolated and that most people present hadn't actually known him or particularly cared about him. This honesty was uncomfortable but also liberating. It freed people from having to perform grief they didn't feel, allowed them instead to acknowledge the reality of his life and their relationship to it. The discomfort people felt wasn't punishment. It was recognition. Recognition that they'd participated passively in Leonard's isolation, that they'd accepted his performance of being fine without questioning too hard whether it was accurate, that they'd taken the easy path of polite distance rather than the harder path of genuine engagement. This recognition was valuable even though it was painful. It made visible dynamics that usually remain invisible, created possibility for people to choose differently in future interactions, generated collective awareness that loneliness often exists behind performances of normalcy. So if you're someone who uses humor to make difficult truths more palatable, know that this is a legitimate form of honesty, that wrapping painful reality in dark comedy can sometimes communicate more effectively than earnest direct statements. The humor isn't deflection or avoidance, it's delivery mechanism that makes unbearable truths bearable enough to be heard and processed. And if you're someone who encounters others' loneliness or isolation or struggle, don't be too quick to accept surface performances of being fine. Question a little harder. Offer inclusion even when it's not requested. Recognize that many people maintain careful facades specifically because acknowledging their actual circumstances would make others uncomfortable, would require others to either help or explicitly refuse to help, either of which feels worse than maintaining comfortable mutual fiction that everything is fine. Leonard's funeral recording didn't redeem his life or transform his loneliness into something beautiful or create closure for anyone. It just stated plainly what had been true, used humor to make that truth deliverable, left people sitting with discomfort that might lead them to engage differently with isolated people they encounter in future. That's not dramatic transformation, but it's not nothing either. It's small increase in awareness, small possibility that Leonard's posthumous honesty might create marginally more genuine human connection for others even though it came too late to create any for him. Be StoryWise.